Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Parent Chat tonight. Our topic this evening is it the blues or something else? So tonight, we're going to be talking about how to recognize some of the signs of depression, how to understand when and how to seek outside support. And we'll talk about parenting strategies to support your child if they're going through a rough spot. My name is Bonnie McDaniel, and I'll be facilitating the conversation this evening, filling in for Sherry Gazit. I'm a member of the Balance in Mind team and a parent educator and the mother of 3 teenagers. I'm also somebody who knows what it's like to watch a child struggle. I want to invite you to participate in our conversation this evening. You're welcome to use the chat box if you have a question that comes up during the presentation. This can be kind of a sensitive topic, so we'd also invite you to use the Q&A box if you want to ask a question anonymously. And we will set aside about 10 minutes or so to respond to your questions directly at the end of the webinar. So joining us this evening is Kristie Neklason. And Kristie is the Director of School-Based Services for Youth Eastside Services, which places behavioral health support specialists in the Lake Washington School District elementary, middle, and choice schools. Welcome, Kristie. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks for having me. Yeah. Are you going to go ahead and turn it over to my screen here at this point?
Yes.
All right. Did you want to go? Okay. I was going to say, did you want to go over to that other? All right. So I think I might have to share screen again. So let's give me 1 second here. All right, back up here to the beginning. And this evening, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of low mood, depressive mood, sort of how to tell if that's normative behavior for an adolescent, or are they really struggling with something more serious? And how should you talk to your child about it? What can you do to help? And when should you get outside help and bring some other folks into the picture? And so Bonnie and I are going to talk about that. And I've got a few slides to share. I'm going to put this one up that just talks a little bit about why yes. And I want to particularly draw your attention to the why yes in your school, the Lake Washington School District part. And you can kind of take a look at that and realize that there are supports for your children in the schools. In the high schools in Lake Washington School District, there are evergreen behavioral health social workers, along with the school counselors who are there as well to help support your children and to talk with you about what resources there are and what might be most helpful for your child. So I want you to go into this knowing that there really are people to whom you can turn, and you can turn to them long before you get to the point where you're feeling really desperate. At least that's what we would like to really encourage. And I think a lot of times as parents, we think we ought to know how to handle this, or we ought to already know this, or we can have a sense of kind of embarrassment about why is my child struggling and others aren't. But of course, we always see, just like our children do, the outside of other parents, other families, what looks like kind of gloss and success. I guarantee you, they all struggle with similar things. And everybody to different degrees, depending on the circumstances, depending on their relationships, depending on kind of their personalities even, right? But thinking about likely, you have more in common with other parents, other caretakers, other families, your children with other children and youth than you have differences from them. And to realize then, therefore, people are out there who are understanding. And then there's a whole lot of people who are out there who are skilled in assisting. And we'll talk some more about that as we kind of go forward here. So as Bonnie and I were talking about this conversation, we kind of started with this point of, well, it's sort of normal in adolescence for there to be a lot of kind of emotional variation, if you will, some drama, some frequently changing moods. Adolescents are really wired neurochemically, honestly, to be feeling things more intensely. And part of that's a function of their brain being still in learning mode and in identifying mode. And they are oriented to new things. But if you think about for yourselves, new things are exciting, but new things are also stressful and challenging. And so there's a mix of that just on the most kind of average, healthy kind of day for an adolescent, or even for us as adults. But you just want to kind of have a times 10 factor, at least when you're talking about adolescents. Now, for sure, some adolescents are much more mellow. They might be, oriented to being quiet. I mean, they just have a different personality, and some are just really, they are always feeling things at the most intense level possible and communicating that. And kind of what's your child's baseline. So that's an important thing to kind of remember. Okay. So feeling things intensely, shifting moods, kind of down 1 minute, happy the next. I hate her, it's horrible, my life is over because of this argument with my friend. And then the next minute, it's all gone, it's all done, it's fine. That kind of tendency to overgeneralize or make it really dramatic because it feels like right now in this moment, this is the worst thing I've ever experienced and it's never going to stop. Having at the same time as all of that going on, which I think can be really triggering for parents, you have this drive for that kind of identity piece where you're having your young people, and I'm talking here primarily about adolescents, from kind of early adolescence on through the high school years, and maybe even to kind of the beginning of the college years, just depending on the individual child. You have that behavior that's also saying, back off, I need to learn how to do this myself. I need to have my time alone, or I need to have my time alone with my friends, on my phone, on Snapchat, on goodness knows what the latest kind of social media platform might be, right? So while we see all this behavior that's kind of triggering our concerns, at the same time, we're having to kind of manage the fact that we don't always know exactly what is going on, and we have these kind of questions in our minds, right? And that sometimes when we offer support, it is rejected. Now, I just spent several days with my 16-year-old nephew and my 13-year-old niece, reacquainting me, whose daughter is in her mid-20s, that's a whole nother story, with sort of the vagaries of living day to day with adolescents and kind of how challenging it really is to always be kind of trying to find a middle path. And the last day that I was there, most of those days, my brother and sister-in-law were gone. That was the reason why I was there. But on the last day, they were back. And there was, my nephew had a soccer game, and the temperatures were going down into the 30s. So the 13-year-old niece, they say, oh, we're putting on our snow coats and our boots and our hats. And, you might not want to wear those canvas sneakers. And so what happens? Well, everything that they suggest, she doesn't do. And I was talking with my brother about that, about how do you navigate that, right? I mean, so you're always trying to figure out, and I just want you to appreciate for yourselves how challenging this is and how good of a job you probably do most of the time. But the outcome isn't like, oh, look at that, I did such a good job that they did exactly what I thought they should do or what I suggested that they do. Oftentimes the norm is that they are going to do the opposite. They are going to test that out. And our job as parents is a lot of times figuring out, well, if we were going on a 3-day snow camping trip where you were going to be out in the elements, you're going to say, no, this is the required gear and you will be taking it and you will be wearing it. If you're going to an hour-and-a-half soccer game, they might have to just kind of experience that if they wore those canvas shoes and they had holes in their jeans around their knees, that they were going to be pretty darn cold. And that no great harm is going to come to them. And you might even keep your mouth closed and let them learn the lesson. So how can you kind of stay in that middle path? We're going to talk more about kind of that after this slide. Don't never fear. I just wanted to point out some things here about how to tolerate things on the first slide is sometimes by just checking it out with yourself. And if you have a partner in parenting, or if you don't have a partner in parenting, I'm hoping that you have a parent buddy. That's just a term that I came up with for myself. So not someone who's like an expert on parenting, and even experts as parents still have to kind of deal with the same kinds of balancing act that you are all dealing with. It just goes with the territory. So we can inform ourselves. We can have our parent buddy who's going to support us. So not tell us what to do or what we're doing is the right thing or the wrong thing, but who's there saying, oh, I know it's really difficult, isn't it? Or maybe to really say, wow, I do think you're doing a really good job. Or, yeah, that is kind of how they do things. Or, yeah, I don't know, maybe I would start to worry now. Or it'd say, hey, want to go for a walk and kind of like, let's tell some jokes and forget all about this for a while, right? I think everybody needs to have a partner in parenting. And so really thinking about that if you don't have that privilege of, creating something like that for yourself. So
I'm just going to jump in and
go ahead, buddy.
Kristie, and say that has been of tremendous value to me when I figured out that, it was really helpful for me to find those people that I could just go and vent with and talk about what I was experiencing and, not necessarily to try to help me fix the situation, but just to, someone to hear my side of the story. Because, that would help me. It kept me from expecting my kid to take a lot of interest in my side of the story.
Right, exactly. Because in adolescence, that's not likely to happen, right? I mean, I've heard that it really takes your children, having children themselves or being in that kind of a parenting role to really fully appreciate their parents and what they do. Otherwise, it's sort of like, okay, right? So just to keep yourselves from kind of day to day fretting back and forth, like, should I be doing something? Is this a problem or that? I just wanted to kind of lay out some markers for you that would suggest when those kinds of normal kinds of moodiness, kind of volatility, drama, all those things, and that kind of pulling away, when that's going on, to think, well, is this really persistent? I mean, is it like something that's alarming and it goes on and on and on? It's not like a one-time thing or an occasional thing, right? Is it just happening regularly, day in and day out? Or is it kind of like, well, every so often, right? Is it extreme, what's going on? So there's the tears and the slamming of the door, and then there's the coming out later and kind of like, oh, sorry, kind of lost it there, or I'm feeling better now, or just the coming out, not saying anything, but being kind of fully present again. And then there is the crying and crying and crying, constantly sad, in your room, not coming out. So there's an extreme of something. So it's kind of like there's twos in this, right? And I didn't put two here because two is kind of a judgmental term. And I wanted to stay away from that as saying, like that's too much or too often or, too intense. But in my mind, that is kind of the way that I am picturing that. It's just without the kind of judgment, because that's not a matter of good or bad. That's just a matter of what is and dictating kind of what a response is. So it's sort of like, does your child have a cold? So they're stuffed up and they're uncomfortable, but they don't have 103-degree fever and they haven't had it for 3 days. So it's helpful sometimes to kind of think about that in those other kind of physical terms, because we're all much more comfortable in that realm sometimes, not having kind of the same judgment and the same fear when we think about physical health, as opposed to when we think about kind of emotional well-being or mental or emotional health. I also put down there, is there a cluster of concerning behaviors? I mean, is it kind of one thing that's going on that you're kind of scratching your head about or feeling some concern about? Or is it, wow, every day there's 5 things, you know, they're missing school, they're not doing their homework, they seem to be depressed, they're snappish and irritable, you found some kind of, you know, strange substance around, or maybe they came home under the influence, and there's multiple things going on. That's another time to go, no, we got to do something here. Also, if there's an abrupt or really distinct change in behavior. So I said before, you know, every youth has their own personality. All kind of caretaker, parent, child relationships have their own personality. You kind of are there seeing kind of what's going on most of the time. And not to say that you couldn't have a child that you were concerned about their baseline. I didn't think that's possible. But most of the time we're talking about when that baseline has changed. And not just changed because of adolescence. I mean, because that's back to that normative thing where you do see that all of a sudden, you know, your sweet snuggly little kid is like slamming the door and pouting in their room, or, you know, doesn't want to talk to you, or says fine or nothing. And you're kind of walking through that and trying to find, again, that kind of middle path with that. So abrupt or distinct changes in behavior. Is what's going on seeming to interfere with their ability to function as part of the family, their responsibilities at school or at home, their relationships with friends? So are they kind of hanging out in their room sometimes because they kind of need some privacy, and maybe they're, you know, chatting with their friends, or they're drawing, or they're reading, or they're just lying there listening to music or watching some dumb YouTube video? Or are they like no longer communicating with their friends? They've broken off those ties. They don't come out at all. They don't socialize with the family. Or if what they're doing is causing harm to themselves or others. So in terms of, I put serious emotional or physical harm. So emotional being, you know, are they being really, really mean either to themselves or to you or to others? Having, you know, anger and aggression, is that manifesting itself physically? Are they cutting on themselves? Are they smashing things? You know, if there are things like that going on, another thing to say, yeah, I think this is more than just kind of the normal sort of thing going on here. So here I just was looking at depression in terms of, you know, we all can feel sad. Sometimes we can feel sad because we're tired, out of sorts, overwhelmed, disappointed in ourselves because we didn't do well on something. There's a lot of different things that can kind of influence that. And that tends to sort of pass. We can also have kind of low mood or sadness because we've suffered a loss, a rupture in a relationship. Those things go on for longer. But anybody could look at those and go, yeah, that makes total sense. Life is not such that it yields to happy, carefree attitudes day in and day out. Life can be difficult, and it can be difficult for our young people just as much as it is for us. Then there's a shift from that when you have sort of this, again, persistent and extreme, where there is really serious low mood. There's lack of motivation, there's fatigue. I mean, there's a physical element, there's a mental element, there's an, you know, emotional element, and it goes on and on. That's that persistence again. Or you might have more of a low key, just kind of sad and just low mood, and that's the only thing that somebody seems to experience. And I remember my daughter, after her sophomore year in college, said, she came home on a break and she said, I think I've just felt sad. all year, just sad. I haven't felt anything else. And it was like, that's not okay. We need to go talk to your doctor and find out kind of what's going on and see if we can shift that for you, because that is not kind of the norm, right? So some warning signs then of depression as being different from kind of being sad or having the blues on occasion or in reaction to something that anybody would feel sad or be grieving about. So how then do you talk with your kids about this? So on here, and I want Bonnie to kind of comment on this, because the top ones really are about us taking care of us in this situation and acknowledging sort of the challenge of it, to walk that middle path between always kind of evaluating, kind of on the normal end, yeah, I pretty much think so. Oh, I'm really feeling kind of concerned about this. And so there's the part that has to do with you first before you even start to kind of navigate it and naming it with your child. And Bonnie, would you share some of those kinds of thoughts that we were talking about before in terms of parents kind of taking care of themselves?
Yeah, thanks, Kristie. So part of my background is in social emotional learning. I'm a huge proponent of that, and you may have heard of that as something that your kids are talking about or learning at school. And but social emotional learning is you develop those skills, and you can develop them your whole life. And I just want to say, for my part, I had the opportunity to develop my own social emotional learning skills as my children were struggling a little bit, and especially all the way through those teenage years. That, you know, our kids give us lots of opportunities because they know how to push our buttons. And so the challenge there first is to just be aware of how you're reacting, right? Just notice, how are you feeling? You know, what thoughts are coming up into your mind? What's going on in your body? Are you feeling tense? Are you noticing that your shoulders are bunching up? Are you frowning? Those sorts of things. It can be really helpful just to be aware of how you're reacting. And, you know, even just becoming aware of that is a step that can help you regulate. Just automatically developing that awareness can help you to regulate those feelings. And so if you find yourself in that spot, and I'll just say that I did my first, you know, if I feel like my kids are struggling, then I want to protect them. You know, I want to, and, you know, we come by this honestly, right? Like when they're little and they are going to put something in their mouth, you know, you reach over and you grab it and you keep them from having that harm, right? And so it's kind of I think it's a natural parental instinct to want to reach in and help. But in these situations, sometimes that isn't the most helpful thing that we can do. So it does require taking a pause and being aware of what's coming up for you. Because if you're in that kind of a reactive state where you're feeling fearful or you're really worried about what's going to happen in the future, then it's not really possible to be present, fully present with your kid in that moment, and to be projecting a kind of calm, reassuring presence that your kids, that can be really helpful, especially when someone is struggling. If you can communicate, Dan Siegel has an acronym called, it's COAL, which stands for calm, open, accepting, you know, really accepting of what is in this moment, and love. Then those are ways of being, even in difficult times, maybe even especially in difficult times, that can really help whoever you're talking to regulate themselves or feel, you know, just even if they don't say anything, just feel the sense of a little bit more ease.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And that really is kind of that heart of managing and taking responsibility for and being transparent about your own anxiety in the situation, your own kind of struggles that you're having. And really what you're doing there, Bonnie, is not only are you doing that for yourself so that you are able then to demonstrate that you care and can have some awareness about what your child is saying and going through. It's really hard to do that if we're caught up in kind of our own fear and anxiety, right? Because what we're going to naturally look for and what's going to communicate to our child is, what's the salient thing here is, my feeling better, my getting calmer, my being reassured. And our kids, most of them, not all of them maybe, want to protect us. They also want to protect themselves from consequences and limits and other kinds of things or being in trouble. But oftentimes they want to protect their parents from having difficult feelings and other things as well. And so if they feel like that's where this is going, it's going to compound their shutting down. They're saying, I'm fine, it's fine, never mind, don't worry about it. Whereas if you have taken that kind of time to do that for yourself, in terms of that calming and kind of getting into that more open stance where you can listen and not, you might be freaking out kind of inside. I can remember some times of doing that. And I remember one time in particular, I was driving the carpool. So this was younger kids, and they were telling me about a joke that someone had said, I think they're second graders, at school that day. And it was a very long one and very detailed, and it was very raunchy. And I think they had not a clue what it meant. But I was so surprised. And so I'm kind of like going, okay, if I like freak out here about this, that's what they're going to remember. And it's going to like just reinforce kind of, all the things I don't want to. I mean, for some children, that would make it be like, ooh, we got a reaction there, so let's do some more of that. Or for some, it would be like, oh no, I feel terrible and bad, and I'm never going to tell you anything again because you got so upset about that. So it's like, oh, and who was that shared that? Oh, what was going on? And sort of asking some of these sort of open-ended questions so you could kind of learn more, while inside freaking out, but on the outside being able to kind of manage those emotions. And speaking of social emotional learning, there's this great thing, you're not gonna be able to see it very well, but it's called the mood meter. And it's got these 4 categories here of different colors. And if you go in there, you can choose on a quadrant of how much you feel about it. And it's going to bring up all kinds of different terminology and emotions that you might feel. So here I was in high energy, unpleasant, and I can click around on that. And if I have really high energy, I'm really stressed, and it's very low pleasantness, panic, jittery, stressed. It can go all the way to peeved, concerned, furious, angry. If I go to sad, I can be in disheartened, lonely. And this is kind of a fun thing to play around. It's a free app, the Mood Meter. And it is used in the social emotional learning in the elementary school grades. And sometimes there's occasion to kind of play around with that with your kids and do some of that modeling, like, oh my goodness, earlier I was like this, and someone showed me this mood meter thing, and I was like playing around with this and trying to find the right word for it. And isn't this kind of cool? And your kids, some of them would be responsive to that, some of them would not. But part of what that says is, well, I'm not just focused on you as being kind of the problem here. I'm also like a human being, and I regulate my emotions and kind of manage myself. And you're also showing kind of how to do that. And if you have a little levity in there, you can laugh at yourself a little bit. That always helps. We can all use a little bit of that kind of grace and space. And so if we can kind of do that for someone else by sort of, kind of taking a little bit of a one down for ourselves, like, oh, I didn't handle that one very well, so next time I think I'm going to do this or that. And this, then it's like you're being transparent, you're being non-judgmental, you're modeling kind of how they can kind of care for themselves. And you're probably teaching more in doing that than if you were to say, this is what you need to do. Besides which, in adolescence, our kids really need those opportunities to be figuring things out for themselves. Not to say that they need to be left alone on that. I think they need discussions. I think they need to see and observe us problem solving and working things out. So for example, back to that example, my brother with his daughter, rather than kind of like, you need to go put on these things, and it then blowing up to this thing, well, and I'm just not going kind of thing. It's sort of like, well, we're going to be wearing wool hats and boots and things like that. And, gosh, you think you might be cold in that? No, don't think so. Oh, okay. And so you modeled the behavior. Well, guess who was right? But you don't have to say so, right? So you're showing, and then you're allowing them to kind of go, well, I didn't figure that one out very well, did I? I might do differently next time. A really, really important thing here is to be showing that care and concern and awareness of them. So because all your relationships are different, because all your kids are different, the way that you show that you care is going to be different as well, right? You just need to figure out what is it that communicates that to your kids, and have that front and center. And I think that's why that's in Dan Siegel's acronym at the end, is that love or loving, right? It's so important. The relationship is ultimately the most important thing for both that normative development, those normative experiences, as annoying and distressing as they may be, and when it gets to the pinch of we need to take action because something really distressing is going on for our kids and we need to kind of step in. And before you start to go for the, let's talk about that, how might I help? Here's maybe some suggestions, or I heard you saying this and I'm not sure that's really true. Can we kind of look at what evidence you might have for it and kind of having that more problem solving conversation? I think it's really important first to have listened and to have validated their feelings. And validating their feelings is not the same as saying, yes, I agree with what you did, or yes, I agree with that viewpoint or opinion. It is simply saying, I see that you are going through something here. And to you, it's difficult, or it's sad, or it's angry, or it's exciting, or whatever it might be. I see that. I may experience it differently and have some different thoughts and opinions, but I see how you are experiencing this in the moment. Bonnie, can you think about kind of, I know when you were talking about working through things with your own kids, that I'm thinking that that frequently came up, where there's that need to, trying to validate kind of their experience. But when you really like, no, I don't want you doing that, or I so disagree with that, or.
Yeah, it's so hard. And that's why, these are expert master level social emotional learning skills to be able to, be aware of that urge to fix it, especially when, if there's a problem that you just, it's hard for you to see your kid in pain. You don't want them to be in pain. And that urge to jump in and try to problem solve it for them is so, I think it's normal.
Yeah,
and so
very.
if you notice that and you're aware of that, I think if you can understand some of the things, and again, this is not something I did right the first time, I've learned afterwards the importance of asking them what they think, even if they're, when they're in a tough spot, like, can you help me understand? That's a phrase that I think can be really useful. Can you help me understand what you're going through, what you're feeling, what you're thinking? And as you're doing that, it's really helpful for you to cultivate your understanding of what they're going through, if they're willing to share, because you may not know very many of the details of their experience. And the other thing as a parent that, oh, well, I went through something similar when I was a kid is common. And
Yep.
From what I hear, not so helpful, often not so helpful. Sometimes it can be, but it does seem to be placing your experience in front of theirs. Whereas what can be really helpful is to really foreground and show your care for their experience. And so again, my Dan Siegel would talk about seeing the mind behind the behavior and allowing your kid to feel really seen by you in those communications, by being curious about their experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's so important to all of us to just have that simple experience of being seen. And I know we have that feeling in our adult relationships as well sometimes, where it's like, well, perhaps we have a spouse or even a friend who goes right to the fix it. So we're trying to say, oh, I'm really struggling with this, and we just want to be heard, right, and seen. And they're going to, well, how can I bring my expertise to fixing it? And their intention is very good, but we know that feeling, and that feeling isn't good. But once you have that feeling of being seen and heard, then that's when problem solving coming alongside of your child can be really helpful. And a suggestion for kind of navigating that when, you know, there might be a situation that has some similarities that you've been through or that you know somebody that went through. And sometimes I might just say, well, you know, it's not exactly the same, but that made me think about this time when, and keeping it kind of brief and then saying, is that kind of at all like what you were experiencing? So you're offering something rather than you are kind of applying something, like saying that is like this. It's saying, well, is that kind of like this? And so it's a different kind of tone and a different kind of approach. And again, we need to kind of be in our good, calm space to be able to do those kinds of things. That's kind of, I think about that as sort of the middle path, right? Between like, just like, oh, no big deal, and I'm just ignoring this, or I'm on the other end going, oh my God, you know, the house is burning down and I have to do something about it kind of right now. So it's a way of talking through things while listening and while being maybe kind of tentative, and you're not telling somebody what to do, but maybe you're exploring options with them. And sometimes that's really important. So again, this is about giving our children the opportunity to be developing that independence, but being alongside them while they do that. In particular, like middle schoolers, you know, they say, well, there's a lot of that kind of goes back to toddlerhood, where it's like 1 minute I need to be with you, but then I need to go out and then I need to come back. Well, they need to know that you are there. And they also need to know that there's kind of a safe limit out there and what that is as well. And so I think that that applies here in terms of kind of having both of that, being the kind of the root in the center you can come back to, but you can kind of go out, have those experiences kind of come back, come and go, and get that kind of movement and sort of be tolerant of that with our child. So now let's see, I wanted to move to my next slide and somehow it doesn't seem to want to do that. Why not? I left it here too long and it got, okay. So some other things then, if you're thinking, you know, I think things really aren't going well here, that you can do with your child. And if we're talking about kind of, this is a matter of sort of that low moods, the blues, maybe some depression going on, we're kind of not sure. So one of the things that oftentimes we all do when we are not feeling so well and we're feeling kind of down is to sort of retreat or to isolate. Now, some of that is okay. And actually, you know, a medical practitioner once talked to me about how feeling a little down and depressed can be kind of part of when you're ill. And it's a message. I mean, it's a sort of healthy reaction that keeps you slowed down because you need to rest and get well and you need to not be out and going. So if that's happening, that's going to be relatively short term, right? And you just kind of want to know what that is. But if you full on go into retreat and you're isolating, that is not helpful to depression. It's sets kind of a stage for being able to kind of think those depressing thoughts without them being interrupted, to sort of reinforce all of that kind of negative thing, sort of blocking out kind of anything that might break that. And also it's a lot of times physically, there's no physical movement here as well. There's no connecting with others, but there's no movement of your body. And so everything is kind of shut down at a time when what is probably helpful is, you know, in therapy language, they call it activation. So it's like, and this is really difficult with depression because when people are depressed, whether it's a little bit down or it's very depressed, the last thing you kind of feel motivated to do is get up and go out and do things with other people. And those are the kinds of things precisely that are helpful to do, even to break kind of the less kind of profound or less extreme kinds of depression. So you want to approach this with some gentleness, because if you're just like, unless again, you know, if your kid is refusing to come out of their room, has been in there for literally, days, and you are terribly distressed, well, then I think you do go to, I'm sorry, you need to get up, you need to get out here, you need to eat, we need to go get some help. And if that won't happen, then you need to say, well, I'm going to go figure out how to get help. And then we'll talk a little bit later about accessing kind of that help. So you see how there's this kind of work of kind of like, where are we with this, right? But in general, a little bit of this is okay, but very much of it, not so much. So some of that is just kind of sharing that, like, hey, this is the natural tendency. And it seems like that's kind of what's going on with you, is it? And like, yeah. And I also kind of, have really heard from, things that I've read or other people or my own experience, that just being in full retreat, it is just kind of reinforces it and makes it worse. And so as hard as it is, I'm going to help you get up and get going. And so then figuring out how, knowing your child and what they typically like to do or who they're positively connected with, orchestrating those things, creating those opportunities, nudging, kind of things like that. Now, the tricky thing here in this parenting business is that you don't get this automatic satisfaction of when you do it well, your child responding like, oh, that worked, or I appreciated that, or that was great. You might actually get a lot of like back talk and pouting and resistance. And I remember my daughter, we used to talk through kind of sort of some of the negative self-talk and some of the, generalizing, like this terrible thing happened and it's always going to happen, and sort of, kind of what evidence do you have for that? Or I'd make suggestions about things. That's what I mean by, people who do things professionally. Still, at the end of the day, they're human beings who are parenting, right? And she would, when she's 14, 15, be like, well, that just doesn't work, Mom. I've tried that. And then fast forward a couple of years, and it's like, she'll be telling me like, oh, well, I've been practicing, really kind of challenging myself about these negative ideas, or something else that I've suggested to her, or some other person who I'd have suggested to her. I'm like, interesting. Okay, guess it does work after all. And so you can't be expecting that if you're doing it well. This is where that parent buddy comes in again, right? Or maybe, it's a parent coach who is, somebody that professionally you're employing, who's not a therapist, but who is kind of helping you on that journey of figuring out that middle path and kind of how to do it, because it's really hard, right? And you're not going to get that reinforcement from your child most times. And if then you're feeling like your gut is, oh no, something is really wrong here, trust that feeling and reach out and get help. So accessing those supports at school or in the community. I did see a couple of questions in here where I'm going to come back to that in a moment, that were, well, one was about kind of YES and YES having their intake closed. It is actually open now. You can call and schedule. Things are still moving slowly at YES, just as they are kind of, we were talking earlier, across kind of the field, whether we're talking about private practice therapists or we're talking about community agency therapists. There's a lot of need, and there's not enough of the resource to go around. And some of that is related to COVID and just this kind of strange time of upheaval that we're in, where there's a lot of movement all around. And some of it just is that there's more need than there is resources to fulfill it. So there are probably going to be waits, but I think you should get on the wait list. Trust yourself if that's something you feel like needs to happen. And if you have supports at school, it's always a very good place to start. And the evergreen social workers, or where there's the YES behavioral health support specialists in the middle and the choice schools, they can oftentimes talk with you, talk with your child, be doing some supportive things, helping with some of that social emotional learning, holding some of those pieces while you're waiting for services to kind of really dig deeper and kind of really help get through those rough spots, and hopefully then preventing that from getting to where you need urgent help and are looking at situations where you're feeling like depression has escalated to suicidality, and where you're having a child who's feeling really helpless and hopeless, or just so agitated and miserable. And sometimes depression, I didn't mention this before, but I really think a lot of behavioral health issues, including substance abuse, anxiety, depression, they have a neurophysiological or a genetic base. And so I think about it as building blocks, right? So some of us, we don't have any choice over that. It's just the way that kind of our DNA and our neurochemistry is. And it's very complicated things that go into that. So some of us, you know, we have a bigger building block at first. That's true for our kids too. Has nothing to do with kind of parenting or anything else like that. And then there's kind of like the stresses of life and the environment, both kind of, you know, stuff happens in life, right? And that can be like a little bit or medium or a lot of stress in the environment. And then I think, you know, for different things, it's like, what's the exposure to some of the types of behaviors that don't work very well. So with substances, you know, if you end up using substances to kind of self-medicate or out of curiosity or whatever it is, that kind of takes on a life of its own as its own building block. If you get started down the pathway of kind of self-harming as a way to kind of deal with feelings, that builds something in and of itself. If you start getting involved in relationships that are unhealthy, or just other kinds of either risky behaviors or antisocial behaviors or avoidance, all those kinds of things, I think about it's kind of like the third building block, because when we do things over and over again, it reinforces itself. So our job is we want to interrupt that, right? So hopefully we can notice and interrupt some of those patternings and even talk with our kids about how there are these building blocks. And some of them, you know, they're not culpable around that. It just is that way. And so what's the best way to take care of themselves given kind of who they are? And we can get in there and we can kind of set up multiple pathways through which they're going to have more positive experiences and opportunities to heal and to learn those social emotional skills and abilities, and recognize that we should not be expecting ourselves as parents, when things get to kind of to, it's more persistent, it's more frequent, it's more extreme, we should not be expecting ourselves to have all of those answers and that knowledge and be able to do that. You wouldn't expect a therapist to just be able to fix it either. It's really got to be that there are multiple places where positive things are happening for the kids, at home with you and building that positive relationship, at school with friends, you know, doing fun things and activities. It's sort of that whole child kind of mentality. And then having the pathway that is about kind of really looking at emotional wellness and people who are skilled in using certain techniques and aren't the child's parents or caretakers, because there's a certain, it's not like you could have a magic wand and then say exactly the same things that a parent says, and all of a sudden the child's going to go, oh yeah. But when you have that different relationship and you're skilled and you have, you know, learning and experience and education around best practices in helping people develop healthy patterns of doing things, well, it can sometimes help that you're not the parent or the caretaker, right? There's a different kind of freedom that's there because your child doesn't have to prove something to them in the same way that they may feel like they have to prove it to you. And they don't have to take care of that person the same way that they feel like they might have to take care of you. So whenever we're talking about depression and low mood, I do like to point out that, you know, having thoughts about dying, having thoughts about dying by suicide, these are not things that are unfortunately totally out of the norm. And so I think we need to do kind of what Bonnie was talking about earlier in terms of that kind of preparing ourselves and working on our own skillfulness around this, because this is scary territory. And we don't want to be kind of so freaked out that we shut down and become unaware, or that we go so far to the other extreme that our child just totally shuts down and we can't find a way in. And so we're all the way at, we're having to call 911 because we don't have any other pathways to go. So here's just some really basic kinds of things about if you hear your child saying this, or if they've said it to a friend or to others, then it's addressing it. Keeping your cool, really hard to do, but we've talked a lot about kind of things that you can do, day in, day out, ahead of time, so that you would be able to manage to get through this situation and then get support for yourself. Just to say, I heard you say this, or I've heard your friends wonder, or I've noticed this behavior. And you notice there's a lot of I's, and back on our other page when we were talking about like helping your kids, there's a lot of I statements. I noticed, I'm concerned, I this, instead of you, because sometimes you in this sentence comes across as there's something wrong with you, or we're having some kind of judgment, or our child's intuiting that. So really using that language about, I'm noticing this, I'm concerned, I love you. And if you get a lot of like, I'm fine, I don't want to talk about it, but there is something that's happened multiple times. So perhaps, you've noticed, cuts on your child's arm more than one time, and they've had some kind of excuse about it, saying, I realize you may not want to upset us, or, to be in trouble, and you're not in trouble, but we have to deal with this. You've told me twice that those scratches came from this. However, I think there's something going on, and I'm really concerned about you. And so we are going to kind of really reach out and get some help, because I'm not an expert on this, right? Have you been thinking about, taking your own life, being dead? Talk to me about that. What's going on? Opening that door. If they don't say something, don't back off entirely. Keep your eyes open. Plan for safety in the environment. We always say here, if you have a child who is depressed, or who has ever kind of gone to this place with self-harm and ideation about that, is check your household for safety. You don't want to have guns that are accessible to kids when they are depressed, or having this low mood, or you have concerns around this. You want to look and make your house as safe as possible, and then maybe talk about some kind of safety planning about how can we take care of you, how can you take care of yourself, and you want to reach out and get some help here. It's hard work. So crisis connections I put here because you can call crisis connections really pretty much any time and talk with them. And there's also crisis text line that I didn't put on here, which is you can text anything to 741-741, you or your child. And you can talk through the situation. You can get tips. They can help you evaluate whether you should be going to the hospital, you should be getting the police, you should be getting a counselor. You do not have to be in a life or death crisis to call crisis connections or to use that crisis text line. They're about kind of avoiding having those things happen, because if those things happen, you want to be calling 911 and getting immediate life or death help. All right, so let's go back to some other kinds of resources here. So here's the crisis text line, the crisis line, Teen Link for your teens, a national line, the YES number here. So they are currently, like I said, they are scheduling intakes or scheduling a bit out. There are 5 other community behavioral health agencies that some take insurance, some only take Medicaid. And then here there's the Children's Hospital referral line, where they will help you track down, kind of navigate the system to find a therapist, either at an agency like ours or in private practice, who can work with you and your child around whatever the issues are. So that's a really helpful thing, because sometimes it's really hard to navigate the system. And then if you have to be on a wait list, be on the wait list. Reach out to your supports at school, so that if there's a wait time, you're building kind of that, the more kind of, healthy, concerned adults that you can have, as well as healthy peer relationships and activities and other kinds of things, the better. again, knowing your child, and some kids are introverts, so they don't want to be always out there, and doing all of that. So again, personalize this to your child, but this is where it's really helpful to have that parent partner or others to kind of help. I want to go back and see if there's another question here. Yeah, call after the 1018. I do see that there. One thing that you can also try in terms of kind of with YES or at your schools, and sometimes there are fee-for-service counselors who are going into the schools from YES potentially, or from others who can see kids at school. And sometimes there's a different process. So feel free to ask your school counselor, hey, is there a way to kind of start a referral either for YES? Are there counselors here from other agencies that my child might be able to work with?
Kristie, there is a question that came up about, does YES offer any small group parent education classes to dive deeper into learning how to help children with anxiety, depression, substance abuse, addiction, eating disorders, etc.?
That is great. I wish we had a robust menu like that. At the moment, we are not currently doing any, but we have from time to time, and I believe that we are currently looking at starting a DBT program for parents. That's dialectical behavioral therapy, but it's a lot of really good emotional regulation skills for parents to do alongside their kids. To participate in something like that, you would want to have your child being a client at the agency and already participating in the program. So, starting that process. And then also we have done a small group for parents of anxious kids, and we'll likely redo that. I'm sorry, I can't tell you kind of exactly when things are happening. I think we were looking at doing a group similar to that in Mandarin in the near future. So our website should always have those on there. And if you are connected, if you're at one of the middle schools, staying in touch with your YES behavioral health support specialist. And we do occasionally do some things through the schools in that way as well, in addition to doing the more general parent education like this program. Good question, and glad to hear the interest in that. I will communicate that. Anything else there, Val, that came through the chat that?
I just wanted to, there are a couple. I wanted to also note that NAMI Eastside, which I'm putting in the chat, has a family-to-family 8-week class for families that have children with severe mental health conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar. There were some other ones listed. And you can contact them about that class. Again, it's free and is a community resource, and NAMI Eastside is just a generally good resource to have as well.
Kristie,
Bonnie, you were talking about that resources for parents earlier.
Yes, so one of them is, you had mentioned the Evergreen social workers, Evergreen Health, and sometimes they offer parent classes as well, and drop-in hours for teams. So I want to let everybody here know that we will be, if you registered, as you did, you register for this webinar, you'll receive a follow-up from us that will contain these resources. So if you didn't get them all, don't panic. We'll send that out to you, as well as a link to this recording, so you can watch again. If it's a lot of information that kind of flew by kind of fast, so we'll make that available to you. And I notice that we are coming right up at the 8 o'clock hour. So
is it possible, Bonnie, that we could take just a couple of questions? There's two that came in on the in the text chat that I'd like to just run by you guys before we sign off.
Sure. Can you take a few minutes, Kristie?
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. You can stick around. We'll go ahead and answer those questions if you need to go. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. And as I mentioned, we'll be in touch and we'll follow up with some resources for you.
Great. Thank you. Both of you are fabulous. Some of the questions that came up, one is, I recently found my son's suicide note in his bedroom that he wrote last October. We talked with him about it, but he said he was fine and refused to talk about it. What should my husband and I do in this situation?
Right. So I'm glad you talked to him about it. And I'm hoping that part of that conversation was about, hey, when you think back on that, what was going on at the time that kind of made you feel that way? What might happen differently kind of, in the present? How did you get through that? What do you know now that could kind of help you get through that? I think if you are noticing distressing behaviors, so kind of going back to kind of that, like things that are going on and they're a little more persistent, extreme, there's a cluster of things and you're still actively concerned, then I think it's time to kind of name that to him and say, I know this was in the past, and I know that you want to really reassure us that you're fine. And we're still concerned, and life is difficult, and sort of everybody needs a coach now and again. And so we're going to pursue kind of getting this kind of help and support both for you and for us. And, we can check it out. And if it seems like it's really terrible, well, we've got some feedback and we can make some changes in the future. But we're going to take some first steps in that. And then also just thinking about who are the other support people besides you in your child's life. Are there other kind of supportive adults? And if not, could you connect them up with those so that, sometimes as a coach, sometimes as a teacher, sometimes it's the counselor at school, sometimes the family friend. So that there are other kind of eyes and ears that are there in case there's something that's preventing him from communicating that with you.
Something I would just maybe add to that is make sure that he has the numbers, the Teen Link and the crisis line. And, some people I talk to say they just go ahead and put those numbers in their phones just so that they have access to that should they need it. Give some hope that things can get better. Sometimes that can help just motivate maybe a little bit to take a step toward getting better.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Yep.
Awesome. There was another question that came up because we always direct people to the crisis numbers, suicide prevention line, et cetera. And one of our attendees noted that there have been a lot of complaints on the suicide prevention line where people are waiting hours and end up hanging up, and that people at the other end of the line are rude and condescending. Do you have any information on that? Should we avoid giving out the number is the question.
Well, I would certainly want to be avoiding that. And I'm thinking that was the National Suicide Prevention Line. I'm hoping that is not our local 24-hour crisis line through Crisis Connections or the Teen Link or the National Crisis Text Line, the 741-741. I've not ever heard negative things about them. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to be going any place where I was, one, having to wait, and two, then having somebody be rude and condescending to me. So, yeah, maybe we get some clarification about what line that was, and we can look into it and temporarily not be referring there. And I wonder if that's sort of partly kind of just the times we've been in with the pandemic that have just stretched everybody. And so kind of like a first responders like burnout syndrome, or I'm not sure kind of what's going on there, but I'm very sad to hear that.
Yeah, that person said that it's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, just FYI.
Okay.
And then we have one other question, which is, can a counselor at Renaissance School work with kids at Eastlake? This is just how do the behavioral health support specialists versus social workers?
Right, I know that's tricky. And I mean, I wish there was just more resources. So YES has a behavioral health support specialist that goes to Renaissance, but she also goes to International Community School and STEM. So really, no, she can't go to Eastlake. At Eastlake, they had some turnover, I think, with their evergreen social workers. We have a substance use prevention interventionist who responds to the 4 large high schools. And if there were issues around that, she could potentially be helpful. It is possible that we could potentially, get some additional help in there. And I wonder if that parent, if you'd be willing to email me and just remind me that it's looking for resources at Eastlake High School. So my email is KristiN@youtheastsideservices.org, and it's KRISTIEN. Just remind me of that, because I could check in with their administrators and look for some kind of ways of maximizing what's available there.
Last call for any other questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I hope that you heard something that you found helpful to you. We're going to be offering another parent chat in 2 weeks. The topic then is going to be your child, their therapist, and you. And Kristie will be with us again, and we're going to talk about understanding the difference between a parent role and a therapist role, and appreciating the importance of both, and how to establish clear expectations so that you can build a trusting relationship amongst all three of the people involved in that. So join us on October 27th for that. And again, we'll be sending out some more resources. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Kristie, for being with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, Val, for managing the chat. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
Little exit music.
Stop our recording.
Whoa. I'm looking for that. One moment.
Off left.
Okay, there we go.